access and equity in and of itself is a huge buzzword that people want to be a part of, but it's also being taken up by the mainstream in a way that is not critical, right? That is actually not addressing issues of power, issues of identity for students. And so then what is its purpose if it does nothing? It is bland, right? It's like having no salt on your food. You can't taste what is the point of equity if it does nothing for the people who are lacking in power and are needing a space for their voices to be amplified.
That there is the highly respected math educator, Lauren Baucom. Lauren is from North Carolina, and we chat with her today about her powerful and eye-opening 2019 NCTM presentation, Whose Mathematics Is It Anyways? Detracking of teachers and students.
Stick around to hear how you can help students author their identities in math class, how math class should be like Lauren's favorite TV show, The Great British Bake Off, why we should consider how we track or stream students in our schools, and 3 detracking stages Lauren helped to put into place to help reduce inequities in her school.
Cue up that music.
Welcome to the Making Math Moments That Matter podcast. I'm Kyle Pierce from tapintoteenminds.com.
And I'm John Orr from mrorr-isageek.com. We are 2 math teachers who, together,
with you, the community of educators worldwide who want to build and deliver math lessons that spark engagement,
fuel learning,
and ignite teacher action. John, I'm really excited to dive into this great conversation with Lauren. Are you ready to get going?
Oh yeah, of course. We are honored to bring you this episode with Lauren. You'll hear so many powerful insights into our profession that you'll want to listen to this one twice.
Before we dive in and get to our talk with Lauren, we want to thank you for listening to us wherever you are, in the car, at the gym, in the kitchen, washing dishes, or maybe on your prep time. If you've listened to us before and have enjoyed the episodes or have received some value out of it, we'd love to hear about it. We read all of the reviews of this podcast, and right now we want to share one of those reviews with you. This one here is from Sheepdog Tess on Apple Podcasts.
Sheepdog Tess says, first class of the year was a hit. A huge thanks for making these podcasts. I listened to many as I trained this summer and became sold on the idea of changing up my senior math classes. No more boring first classes for me. The activities were a hit, and I was very happy with the engagement. After 16 years, I feel keen for a change.
We absolutely get supercharged when we read a review like this one. It's amazing to us that we're helping teachers here like Tess change her classroom routines. So where are you listening from around the world? We'd love to hear from you. We've got lots of people chiming in from Canada and the United States, but only handfuls from other countries. So dive in there and get those reviews flowing. We love to hear from you, and it helps to keep us pushing forward to keep these podcast episodes coming.
Before we get to our chat with Lauren, how do you create a culture of engagement and participation in your math class to ensure students are leaning in to learn? Then, once students are leaning in, how are we going to tackle new mathematical ideas in ways that build the necessary conceptual understanding and developing procedural fluency over time?
Finally, how can we craft our lessons in such a way that every single student can access the mathematical content and they don't just throw their arms up in frustration? We believe that all of these above ideas are important parts of an effective mathematics lesson, but successfully delivering lessons that deliver on all of these ideas is not always an easy task. That's why we came up with the 3-part framework, our Make Math Moments 3-part framework, to deliver math lessons that students will not only love, but will also learn from.
You can learn more about why we created the 3-part framework and what are the necessary pieces that you need to know about so that you can run your classroom lessons without a hitch. Head over to makemathmoments.com/framework. That is makemathmoments.com/framework. educator.com/framework.
Well, that's enough from us. Here is our chat with Lauren.
Hey there, Lauren. Welcome to the Making Math Moments That Matter podcast. We are so excited to have you on the show today. How are you doing this evening?
I'm doing great, John and Kyle. I'm really excited and honored to be with you guys. Thank you so much for inviting me to be with you.
Oh, fantastic. We are so excited ever since we had the opportunity to see you present at NCTM last spring. We were really eager to get you on to share your story. So for those who may not know a whole lot of Lauren's backstory, why don't you take us on a little bit of a journey? Let folks who are listening understand a little about yourself, fill us in on your role, where you're from, and maybe a little bit about your teaching story. How did you get into teaching mathematics?
Sure. So I am a military brat, and that means that I traveled a lot as a young child. And my father was in the Army for 28 years. And that meant my first exposure to formal public school and education was very different than the large traditional mainstream. I moved 22 times before I turned 18. So I experienced many, many different versions of school. That also meant that I experienced a lot of gaps in what some people would consider a gap in my learning, while it meant that I gained and garnered different things from different regions as I moved around. My sisters, I have three sisters, and so the four of us were kind of a tight-knit unit, and I watched as some of us struggled going through those different pipelines because they were so unique and different, and how some of us excelled, and it really just kind of depended on where we lived and how the system was able to take us in and how they were able to see what we brought as profitable and usable. So I went to UNC Chapel Hill here in North Carolina, and I got there and I was like, well, I have been really successful in math classes most of my life. Maybe I should try on being a math major. And I kind of went down that path for a long way. Ended up graduating with a math degree, and then got out and said, well, what exactly do I do with this except more math? So kind of got stuck there with this idea of how do I define myself if what I got a degree in was what some would call a pure field, where you're not applying that thing specifically. And I didn't want to become a mathematician. So I started looking towards billing analyst positions, and I joined a Fortune 500 company and started climbing the corporate ladder. And I found myself there for about a year and a half. And it was then probably that was my first experience in realizing that I believe at my core that mathematics is social, that it's done in community, and that it's done with people around you, that it involves the society, the community of practice you're engaged in. And without that, it feels lacking. And so doing math in a cubicle just didn't do it for me as the way I thought it would. And then at that point, I look back over my life in mathematics and I realized my sisters were a part of my journey in mathematics because I loved helping them as they were learning, and it changed my trajectory. So I decided to become a teacher, and I went to get a master's degree in mathematics education. And that's kind of where my jumping off point became for becoming a teacher.
When I hear people's stories out here on the podcast, things jog in my memory that, that relate to your story. But something that, that was interesting to me for sure that I want to be more curious about with you for a moment is this idea you said like math is social and you learned that as you went. I'm curious to hear more about your math experience as a student. Like you said, you were successful in math despite bumping around all these different places. Could you fill us in a little bit about what math looked like in those places? What did the classroom environments look like in there? Was it social? Like, did you get that while you were in school, or was that something you learned much later? Like, I'm wondering that backstory about what school looked like for you and how you experienced math.
So I'll trace back far enough to go back to fifth grade to say I had a wonderful teacher in the fifth grade. Her name was Mrs. Sturgis, and it was the first teacher of color that I had. And that is an important marker, I think, in my math journey, because I saw that math was social, but I also saw that I was capable. She spoke a lot of truth into me about my capabilities in mathematics. She honored what I was bringing to the table. And so she helped to define and author me and my identity as a math learner, as somebody who was successful with that. That didn't mean that her classroom looked social. I think it was still very traditional, but she had a very kind way of authoring students' identities and speaking mathematics ability into them just through the authoring of their own identities. And so my education experience was pretty typical. I would say it was the traditional experience of seeing math done in rows, doing it alongside other peers. The speed issue was always there of who could do it the fastest. I didn't really study at home, which of course became an issue when I went to college and was challenged. I do have a couple of interesting stories that I kind of go back to, one of which is when I was a junior in high school. My parents got stationed actually here in North Carolina in Fayetteville, and I attended a private school, mainly because of the stereotype and the derogatory way that often post kids are looked at and typified when they enter into public schools. So while there were public schools that we could go to here in Fayetteville, often the kids on post get told, you're not going to fit in here. You're never going to be able to play a sport. So you might as well go try somewhere else. And so a lot of military families end up doing private school in some neighborhoods where that's the persona and that's the way the kids get treated. So I went to a private school and I was in an Algebra 2 class. And I was in a class where the school was small enough that the honors kids and the standard level kids were in the same classroom. My sister was also in my class, and she's a year older than me. And so that kind of course, created tension. We were high school girls, right? We're a year apart. And even though she's my best friend now, she was not then. And so we didn't really get along well. And that also portrayed itself in lots of classroom experiences, one of which was math class, where I got things right often, and she often struggled to make sense of what was going on. And anytime that I got something right and she did not, the teacher would kind of play that off of each other, like why can't you be more like your sister? I don't understand why this is so hard for you. To the point that there was one memory that I have that's actually very distinct when the teacher said, you have to be the smartest Black girl I've ever met in mathematics. And I was like, wow, that's a really strong statement, especially to think about that she said that in front of my sister, who looks exactly like me. And so I watched my sister's head hit the desk in front of her. And so
another knife in.
Right, exactly. So not only did she struggle to make sense of the instruction that was given, which was traditional in nature, then she was compared to her sister in the class. And then she was colorized and typified for not being intelligent. So I can only imagine why she still to this day, despite many, many years of me telling her, you also are a math person, that she does not at her core believe that as part of her identity.
I really appreciate you sharing those math moments. We always ask guests to roll back into their memory and bring those memories forward. And while sometimes they can be positive, others can maybe not be so positive, but it's really interesting how they stick with us so clearly. And we're definitely going to be diving deeper into this piece. And really, your presentation, I thought, was excellent at NCTM. So for those listening, we are going to dive deeper into that, and specifically with tracking and the pieces around demographics and all of these ideas that are really hindering the access and equity around mathematics. So we are going to go back there. But before we get too far away from it, I know John, he kind of had the angle of going back and thinking back to your experience in the math classroom around this idea of math being social. And in my mind, what really popped out when you referenced your experience in a Fortune 500 company, and you sort of referenced or at least sort of suggested that at that point you realized for certain that mathematics was social. Did you find that you were in isolation a lot in that role, or did you find the opposite? Did you find that in that Fortune 500 company you felt like, or you had to engage in mathematics with other people? I'm really curious to hear that, because I know myself, having never worked outside of education, it's really hard for me when I'm working with students, especially students who are getting closer to their post-secondary education, trying to help them understand how mathematics could be in the real world when I myself haven't actually experienced that. So I'm really curious to get your perspective on that.
Sure. And we should tie a bow on those two experiences together. So let's see if we can do that. Going back to this idea that I think these different moments that we go back and we look at, that they author our identities in a way that help us know who we are becoming. And so, you have in my past several different math moments, one of which, like you're talking about, Kyle, is this one that happened outside of an education frame. It was more in a corporate world, and one that happened inside of an education frame. But both of them are authoring something to me about mathematics being social. One, if you watch my experience in that Algebra 2 classroom, I have no doubt now that when I look back, I can see that my sister's identity in mathematics and her relationship with mathematics was derived out of that very, very important moment, right? There's this moment of isolation that occurs for her, and that occurred socially. It happened in a large classroom in connection with other people through the mode of communication from the teacher to me, not even directed at her. It was indirect. So all of that happened in this really social way. And it authored who she was becoming as far as who she believes she is as a math person. I used air quotes there, which you can't see.
The applause helped me, picture it.
But then you jump forward, and I have this moment to give it more color. I could say I walked in one day and I looked across a very large sea of cubicles in this corporate world, and I'm carrying a polka dot briefcase and a really beautiful mug. And I look out over the sea and I see this one cubicle that is sitting out that has been wallpapered with fabric of numbers. And it's got my betta fish with my flower hanging out, my betta fish plant out. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I don't know that I belong here. And belonging is become something that I keep going back to when we look at these math moments, as it draws fences, it creates inclusion and exclusion. And that all happens inside of a social world. That cubicle, I decorated that way because part of my identity when I graduated from college was that mathematics was something that I enjoyed and I loved doing. And then finding it in the billing world, I was often doing collection calls. I ran the billings program for a program. I ran the billings software for a program that just allowed me to look for discrepancies, consolidation reports, things of that nature. I sent out invoices. And oftentimes, one of my biggest goals was to find big dollar mistakes. And at one point in time, I was doing some credit issues. And so I was looking at different balances to see if there was any issues where somebody had paid anything that was outstanding from a long point of time, or if there was a decimal point error or something of that nature. And I remember getting really excited because I found one that was quite large to me, right? I'm just a beginning billings analyst, and I found a $100,000 mistake. And I'm like, holy cow. This is awesome.
That's a big deal
right?
to me.
I should get a raise for this, I'm like, this is amazing. Like, I found $100,000. That's going to save this company a lot of money. And I went to my superior and was like, look at what I found. And the response that I got was, great, now do it again. And I was like, so fascinated by the difference there between the conceptual nature of math and society and the procedural nature of math and society. That job was very procedural. And like you said, Kyle, it's very isolated, right? I did all of that by myself. And then when I went to go communicate my success, it was, okay, great. That is now a practice for you, and it is a procedure. And that's the expectation for you to find those things. So we're not going to celebrate that. We're just going to mark it as the first one, and we're going to continue to move. It's a really interesting way when you look at mathematics as social and you look at the interactions that happen between people and how that authors who we know we have become.
Yeah. And I really like how you just pointed that out, because so much of what we talk about and what's going on in the classrooms today and what's being shared, in social media about what good classrooms look like is that we're all saying that it's social. It's the interactions, it's the conversations. But like you've just said, author that identity, and it can be detrimental, like it happened to your sister in a social environment. Whereas when you go to the isolation, you've also got these negative kind of things coming out to give you something that makes a memorable moment, but not necessarily one that you really enjoy, right? Like something that's giving you this kind of negative taste about mathematics. Like there's two different sides that it makes me really, really think. And I think it's something that all teachers, we really need to think about if we're going to have these social environments in our room. Like, what are we saying to our students? How are we talking to them? And I always want to reflect back on the way I used to teach, because I think I would, fire myself and because I didn't think about this kind of stuff. I was
Same, right?
the
Yeah.
math teacher that was like, I'm just going to go in and teach my math lesson. And I didn't think about the social interactions. Like I didn't have kids talk to each other. And even then I was probably the teacher that might have even talked to your sister like that. Like it didn't even occur to me sometimes what I was saying to kids and how what I was saying was impacting their beliefs about mathematics, because I just thought we were just doing math problems, and it's such an interesting and important thing to think about as teachers. And I think there's so many teachers that just still don't think about it, that are just handing these kids these ideas about what math is and what math isn't.
The best metaphor that I have for this right now that is helping me make sense of this world. I have discussed this one with my baking friend, Jen White, so much because I think to both of us, this makes perfect sense. We are both deep into the Great British Baking Show. You guys watch that at all?
No.
Oh, you gotta, I would say,
I'll keep
Paul
an eye.
Hollywood. It's so good. It just keeps me up at night. So that's my guilty pleasure show. But one of my favorite things that happens in that show is they discuss baking with such joy and zeal. And one of the things they discuss in there is the concept of lamination. And lamination happens as you're making phyllo dough, or you're making these different doughs, and you're trying to fold the butter into the dough so that it has these really beautiful layers. And the goal of the Great British Baking Show is that Paul Hollywood would somehow come around to your station and be like, that's a good bake, right? That's the goal. And so this idea of authoring our math identities is kind of like the process of laminating butter into the dough that is our kids, right? It's this idea that we're folding in butter over time, and it takes work. And it takes work on our part. It takes work on the dough's part to be able to absorb that butter. And it is like pushed in, these good math social moments that get pushed into the bread. And you're hoping that at the end of this 13-year experiment in society, the kid goes, yeah, that was a good bake, Like they completely get that their identity is strong enough in mathematics and that it's been laminated in across time. And that takes a lot of time to proof. Just all of the different metaphors that come out with baking with that is so helpful for me in thinking about that.
I love that. I love that. And what pops into my mind when you say that is just, and it referenced what John just reiterated and some of the connections he made, but just thinking about our day to day. And he was talking about what we say to students or what we don't say, but then also just in our actions. Students can tell when you're happy, right? And if we're coming into class each day and it's just class, it's just math class. Like, think of the impact that has on students over time, right? Like, if we can't even show passion about what we do for a living, which is educating the future, like how exciting is that? And I'm going to be honest and say that for a time in my career, I wasn't happy teaching because like things weren't going so hot in my classroom. And I'm just picturing that baking show. I have never seen it. I don't watch a lot of cooking shows, but I'm just picturing like they're doing it because they love it, right? And they're just probably using the most interesting words to describe, right? Like the most wonderful adjectives, right? And the mathematician who popped into my mind as I was thinking and reflecting as well was James Tanton.
Yeah.
Because if you listen to James Tanton speak about anything in life, but mathematics in particular, I'm picturing him with like a baker's cap on right now. So, for me, that really resonated.
And I'm picturing like when you said, Lauren, like that's a good bake. Like I'm picturing the kids just sitting back, like feet crossed, like out in front of them, like arms crossed to them, like and just nodding their head. Like that was a good math idea that just happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like the ultimate compliment for sure too. Lauren, let's dive a little bit into your presentation at the NCTM conference in San Diego this past year, which was titled Whose Mathematics Is It Anyway? Detracking of Teachers and Students. I know this presentation for both Kyle and I opened our eyes to how tracking, and we call it actually streaming here in Ontario, how it leads to, systemic inequities in our math class. I know that you and your colleagues embarked on this mission to address this tracking that's happening in your school. What were you seeing in your school and maybe other schools that set you off on this journey? And then we can get into how you did it.
Sure. I think what I saw when I got to the school that I was at in this particular case, I had just come from a large inner city school that was a magnet school. And I don't know if that's the same terminology that you all use.
No, can you let us know what that means?
Yeah, help us out.
Sure, yeah. A magnet school is one where they place it, if it is a true magnet, they place magnet schools in places of poverty. And the goal is to, like a magnet, draw in the populations that are outside of these areas of poverty that come from areas of wealth in hopes of drawing in the money and resources and capital by putting specific programs in these schools that allow specialization for students for their experiences. So dance, art, automotive, different certifications that you can get, international baccalaureate programs. And so I just come from this magnet school.
And it's a high school.
Yeah, it's a high school. And one of the major issues that happens in magnet schools is you get kind of this bifurcation between groups. You have a 40% population of the kids that come from the neighborhood, and you have this 60% population that is drawn in from these outside sources that are expecting excellence in programming. And you look in your classes and you go, how do we get the 40% base students to experience these excellence opportunity classrooms that are drawing in all these other students? And so while I was at the school in the capital city that I was at here in North Carolina, I saw as a staff recognize it and really struggle to think through, how do we work through this? This is a system, and we are creating this educational violence against our own kids. We are actors in that because we are at this magnet school. How do we transfer that so that we can help students eliminate some of the barriers that exist just because of the name of the school, the type of school it is? We made a lot of headway to try to make some moves there. So when I moved to this rural school, I had just come out of thinking about all of that and the training that I received to think through, how do we get rid of some of these systemic barriers for students? And I walked in and I looked at some of the classes, and my honors classes were white, majority male. And my AP calculus class that year had 30 kids in it, and it was majority male and white. If it wasn't white and male, it was white and female. And then after white and female, maybe there were a couple of students of color, and they were generally male. And so I was like, wow, this is so fascinating, because our school was really closer to like 40% white, 40% Black, and 20% Latinx students. And so when you know the populations of the school don't match this courses, you've got to start asking questions about, what are the barriers that are keeping kids entering into these course pathways so that this is our end result? Because the kids in the classroom, once they're there, that's the end result of all of the systemic issues that are occurring to keep them from getting there.
At the other school, the demographics of the neighborhoods and the people that drew in, the 40% and 60%, you were seeing that reflection in classes, and you had been working towards making that true. And then when you went to this other school, it was not that. It was like the dynamic of the school was made up of these percentages, but they were not being shown in, say, the calculus class.
I'll go back and just say the school that I was at, the magnet school, it was definitely still had this bifurcation going on, but there was work going on to address the issues. It was not an equitable situation either, but I think it was one that was at least aware of.
Right. Now, I'm wondering, just out of curiosity, so for that magnet school, would it be basically like if you're in the boundaries, then all students are welcome, or is like application process? Or I'm not sure if you mentioned that or if I missed it, but just to kind of clarify on like who comes into that school and what's that process look like or sound like?
Sure. So to go to a magnet school, if you're not in the base population or the students that live in that neighborhood, then you apply to go to that magnet. And then there's generally either a lottery or there's a system that allows students to be placed and picked to be able to go to that magnet.
In your presentation, I think you outlined kind of 3 stages of detracking, and kind of like how you went, like you saw this, what was going on in your school, and then you and your staff and your colleagues tried to figure out what was going on there, but also like, how do we fix this? Would you mind, for our listeners who were not in your presentation, sharing what were those 3 stages of detracking, and then we can go through them one at a time?
Absolutely. So Our first stage was to try to use data to make metric-based recommendations. So we're discussing there, how do we recommend students for the next level course? And we chose to figure out, how do we use data to make those decisions be metric-based rather than opinion-based? So that was stage one. Stage two was to try to eliminate any remedial level courses that were barriers for students getting into some of those upper level courses. And then the last stage was to eliminate teacher tracking, was to look at our system, to look at the way we were placing teachers into classes, and to have a conversation as a department about what was equitable and what was fair.
I'm wondering, can we go to number one there and talking about data to make metric-based recommendations? And John and I are always very curious, especially when we're speaking with educators from different parts, like outside of Ontario. Here in Canada, we don't have like a common core across the entire country. So even going to different provinces, things happen in slightly different ways. However, there is this underlying consistency in how certain things are happening. So I'm wondering, when this tracking sort of occurs, help us understand why this first stage is necessary. Like, what did you feel or what did you observe happening around you that made you think that, no, we need data here. We need to stop. My guess is going with just what someone's thinking off the top of their head, right? Those unconscious biases come out and all of these things are going on. Help us understand, like, what does that look like or sound like, or what did it look like, sound like?
Right. So I can kind of paint the image there for you to say, I asked a question in one of our department meetings, and I said, how do we decide where a student is going to go next? And the answer was, well, they just move on to the next class. And I was like, that's so interesting. So if a student originally gets placed in, let's say, a double-tracked year-long math class, which is a slower version than the course is offered for other students, then they will always be double-track year-long math classes.
And there's no possibility of moving, say, to a different track.
Then that was my question, was how do we know when a student has been misplaced and could possibly do well on a different track? How do we know when that student has been rutted?
And isn't the point to try to help push them forward, right? It's not that like, okay, now they go down there and they'll pop out at the other end, or at least that's what we're hoping is not going on. But it sounds like that is what was sort of happening, right? Or at least that, unless someone maybe came in and made a case for it, right? Maybe parents came in and said, hey, we want to do something about this. Or is that even possible? Is that even something that happens?
Sure. Well, in North Carolina, we're in a really interesting phase of being a teacher. And one of those things is that parents often can come in and carte blanche change what is going on for a student's pathway. And in some ways, that's extremely beneficial because a student has an advocate and their pathway can change. In other cases, that's extremely lacking in benefit because it means that a student could often be placed on a track that maybe a teacher didn't think they were ready for. And so there's a tension there between just those two realities. And also just kind of calling out there that it shouldn't be fair that a parent is able to come in and change their kid's track just because they have the ability to make it to the school building between the hours when the school is open and ready to listen to them. So if a parent cannot physically go to advocate for their student, then that track for that kid is cemented and sedentary from the moment they walk in the door. And that doesn't mean that the parent doesn't care. It doesn't mean the parent isn't aware. It doesn't mean that the parent doesn't want something better for their child. It's just that the physical hours of when the school building is open, it privileges those who are working at home from home and have the capability of making it to the school to advocate for their kids in that particular way.
I find this very interesting because it sounds like when you are setting off on this path too, that you have the power to change also the way those paths go at your school. And from your presentation, you had outlined those changes you made, because when we reflect here in Ontario is that each school would not have that power. Like even each district here does not have that choice of changing our pathways. We call them pathways instead of streams or tracking. And so a student would choose when they come into the 9th grade, which kind of class they would take in the 9th grade, but then they have, it's almost kind of like a map that they could get to, but also crisscrosses. But that's true for every high school. Like that same map exists for every high school in Ontario. And when I remember sitting in your presentation and you're outlining that you're going to make these changes, I was just kind of in awe and kind of shocked that your school or even your district had the power to just make those changes. So I just found that super interesting.
Yeah. And I think that goes to show, one, that my principal supported me and treated me like a professional and an expert in my field. He was an excellent leader, and he was based out of social studies, but he saw himself as a generalist. He understood that as a principal, his greatest job was to empower his teachers. And he knew that if he could do that, then the school overall experience for his students would get better. And so he trusted me. And that was really important. And so he was willing to give up power to allow me to have some power in making some of those decisions. And I think we were both better for it.
I'm sort of like wrestling in my mind as to the situation that makes most sense or would provide the best opportunity for students. I think what I'm realizing as I'm thinking here and reflecting live with you folks on a podcast is obviously tracking at all, it would be great to just remove it completely. And obviously there's a huge amount of work to be done around that here in Ontario and obviously in the US. Having that ability, that power to be able to change the structure of how students are tracked, given the system that you're currently working in, seems like a benefit in the scenario that you're in. But I could see how that could be maybe a really bad thing in a school where maybe the administrator isn't as supportive as yours or aware of what's actually going on, particularly in mathematics, which is commonly called that gatekeeper subject, right? So there's a lot of weight and a lot of implication to either doing some of those changes or making those changes and putting that effort in or not. And when I look here in Ontario, part of me wonders if maybe at least there's a consistency there, and our pathway system does have places like you said, John, that where it kind of comes together so that the doors aren't permanently shut for students. However, we still have work to do here in Ontario. So I find that really interesting. I don't know, what are your thoughts on that, Lauren? Do you feel like that's obviously in your scenario, I think it worked out well, but when you look at the big picture, the global picture, what are your thoughts on that? Just how districts and even schools have that ability to kind of change the way that sounds like. Do you think there's more of a pro or a con, or is it just a bit of both?
I think a couple things there, Kyle. So I'm going to try to make sure I hit all of them. Number one, I want to make sure that it's clear that I didn't just make up these 3 stages. I didn't make up the metrics that we use. I did a significant amount of research prior to that. And I also knew that I was working on something at a local level that was really local and global at the same time. So this is the local manifestation of a systemic issue of tracking that affects students of color specifically, right? So this is an issue of dominant culture creating a system of status quo that says, oh, if you don't fix it, we'll just continue doing the same thing over and over and over again, which ends up harming those people who come from marginalized communities more than anybody else, because they are the ones that are waiting for the change to happen. And without that change and that power, we as a system of education continue to commit educational violence. That's what Mustafa talks about in one of his articles, this educational violence against students that is limiting any opportunity for them in moving forward. So if you can define tracking as a really easy example of educational violence because it limits the opportunities of that student moving forward in life and what they're capable of becoming. This kind of goes back to our conversation about becoming. So that is really important. I wasn't just kind of delving into this as a social experiment to see if I could change it, right? This is bigger than that. This is from, like I said, I had experience in kind of understanding these systemic issues and why it was important to engage in this change. And I did have a very supportive principal, but I convinced him with research that I knew what I was talking about and he knew what I was talking about. And I think what you're talking about too, Kyle, is this issue of, you're calling it streams, is knowing that they crisscross and allow students to change. The question is, are they changing? Do people change streams? And who changes streams? How do we know that those streams are serving all of our students well, specifically our marginalized populations, because those are the students who typically get pushed into the streams where those streams are committing educational violence, right? Against our students. They're limiting their opportunities. And so we look backwards for that gate, right? Where did that gate first happen that pushed them into the lowest stream so that now they have to wait for an interchange for them to be able to change over into a different stream, to advocate for themselves to get out of that stream? That's all work that people who are in the highest stream don't have to do.
Right. Just those barriers, right? One
Right.
barrier after another. Absolutely.
Definitely a good point that just because there's crossovers doesn't eliminate these inequities that you're trying to fix at your school.
Right. And so I think that was kind of what I saw. And this is often true, right? Equity is now becoming a huge buzzword. Access and equity in and of itself is a huge buzzword that people want to be a part of, but it's also being taken up by the mainstream in a way that is not critical, right? That is actually not addressing issues of power, issues of identity for students. And so then what is its purpose if it does nothing? It is bland, right? It's like having no salt on your food. You can't taste what is the point of equity if it does nothing for the people who are lacking in power and are needing a space for their voices to be amplified. To have those people who are in power and who do have identity in those spaces to be able to come back and help those voices be amplified that don't. So it's just kind of important as a marker to make sure that we realize that equity right now too is a buzzword. And if it's not actually disrupting power structures, then it really has no purpose. It's just a fad.
For sure. And such an important point to make. And I think there's lots of people talking about like access to stuff, but not talking about specifically, like you've just said, how are we making, identity in our math classes and who has the power in our math classes and those choices. I was curious I guess I'm still on the metric-based recommendations that you were thinking about in your work here. I'm really interested in the metrics you chose to look at, but maybe even more interested in the metrics you didn't choose to look at. Like which ones you're like, I don't want to look at that. I think that's something that we want to eliminate for helping us make decisions. I'm just thinking like if I'm an administrator listening to this right now, or if I'm a teacher who's like you, Lauren, who has this power, can help make these changes in their schools, what should they be looking at? And what should they not be looking at?
One, I would say we are in a data saturated society. And so we love data and statistics, even without making inference. And so that's my little statistical moment there. I have fallen in love with statistics mainly because I see us as a society truly loving the numbers, but not actually going back to make inferential reasoning about what the numbers actually tell us. So I will go ahead and throw in at the end of this presentation, I talked about caveats and cautions, and one of them was compromise is really, really important when you're trying to address things that are systemic because you're trying to enroll a large body of people. In this case, it was only 9 people in the department, but still, that is 9 opinions that you have to try to win over in order to disrupt these power structures that exist and these inequities that exist for your students. So some of these metrics, I don't know that I would have chosen, period. This was a set of metrics that we chose as a department. And so your question is, what metrics should we be looking at? I don't know that the statistics that we get from end of course data, which is that one-time shot, is a bad metric. I think it's a good metric to look at. The problem is when we compound that. So when we like to say, oh, I want to look at the end of course test exam or the final exam for a course. And then also I want to look at the student's GPA. Well, those two things are tied together, aren't they? Isn't the student's GPA in North Carolina, at least the end of course test counts as part of their overall grade? Well, that counts into their GPA. So now it's kind of compounding that test score as being something and privileging something in the way that we place students. And it's a 4-hour exam, right? It's just 1 4-hour period. I mean, and I can't even tell you the number of catastrophic events I've had happen during 4 hours exams. I've had a kid throw up. I had a kid with a broken arm. I mean, I had a kid come on in a skateboard that he lost. He was absolutely terrified. I mean, just all the different stories that you can tell about kids and the anxiety that testing produces for 4 hours. And then we use that as a compounding effect to determine how we place students. So some of those metrics, I'm not saying that they're bad, but I think it's important to ask ourselves, how many times are we counting this thing against them? How many times are we counting it for them? I had a different principal at one point in time that instead of asking me to do my yearly teaching evaluation by bringing in a portfolio or bringing in all of my metrics that showed that I was an effective teacher, she said, just bring me evidence from 3 students, or from just, you could pick one student 3 times a year that shows that they grew and learned something. It was one of the most powerful things that I had. And that was actually something that we ended up having a discussion about for a long time. It was difficult to quantify. That was the hardest part. And so we were using metrics that we could quantify. And so, kind of circling back, part of that compromise in choosing those metrics was, what is something that we all could agree upon? Well, we were math teachers, and most of us wanted something that was quantitative in nature. So things that were qualitative in nature, which would have been verifiable for demonstrating a student's mastery, sometimes got thrown out because we didn't feel like we could quantify it in a way that would do service to the kids that we felt like would be fair. And I think we went back several times later and said, I think we could maybe put in a qualitative measure to think about that. But the ones that we chose not to put in at the end specifically were overall performance and benchmark performance. We have benchmarks that are scheduled by our county or sometimes by the state in North Carolina. And those are intended to be formative assessments that allow us to inform our instruction, to know where students are learning and help us to know how we can change our practice to make sure kids are learning and achieving their growth across the year. So using that as a metric for whether or not a student has learned something, to know whether or not they should move on to the next level when they are demonstrating their current mastery at a partial place during the year, felt unfair.
So it sounds like there is no one way to go here. And it sounds like, you're kind of probably always thinking about what data should we be using and which data shouldn't we be using. It's not a clear-cut sort of decision is what we're hearing.
Well, and so I'll give you another one that's really problematic. Attendance or absences for students is the one that we ended up including in our list because, again, like I said, I would never have included that in my list because I know that attendance and absences affect different communities in different ways. And so I think that that already is an inequity. And so now we're going to compound that onto the student who is making it to school, physically making it to school. And now we're going to say, well, because you weren't here consistently enough, we're going to not let you go into a higher math class. Those two things don't align for me.
And despite not being here, you were able to achieve this, this, and that.
Right.
Like, which to me is almost like the opposite. It's like, wow, you were able to do some really, really strong work despite the challenges that you've been facing.
I mean, we can be practical too, and knowing that when kids aren't physically present, it does affect their learning of what we were instructing. It doesn't necessarily mean that they aren't learning about mathematics. They definitely could be learning about mathematics outside of my classroom space. And me not honoring that and pretending like the absence and the attendance issues are actually what's deterring them from learning math. Well, I think there's a big jump there.
And what they're bringing in, like they could have a huge background in math, and just because they're not there with you in that couple months span or half a year span doesn't mean that they necessarily don't know the curriculum content or the standards. Like I had a student like that, and I remember he would come 3 days a week, 2 days a week, and he was smart as a whip. Like he caught on so quick. And I think the old me would have written him off, like the old me would have greeted him at the door saying, oh, you're here today. Here's a whole bunch of work to catch up on, instead of saying like, welcome, and then picking up where he is. And I remember a kid, who had been coming every day and who had been struggling. He wasn't like top of the class, had struggled with some concepts. And he was so surprised that this other student was doing better than him as a mark. He's like, but he doesn't come all the time. I said, well, when he does come, he shows me such great thinking. He's proving he knows the curriculum content. And I know that some teachers would hold that attendance against them.
Yeah, too, John, just kind of thinking through that, they may have really great adult interactions at home, but ones that may not necessarily put school as the biggest priority, because for some, it's just something different. And so I think all of us have mentioned in this conversation that at one point in time in our educational career that we had deficit mindsets about the way students came into our spaces. And I think that is a process of humanizing the students that we work with, right? It's not just exposing them to who we are and being vulnerable with our experiences with them, but it's also being vulnerable to accept their experiences with us, acknowledging the experiences that they have, and also taking them as a human and recognizing that that is what we were talking about at the beginning, is math is social. So we also are in these defining moments with them. And if we define their excellence based on their attendance and their absences, then that's what's being laminated into their identity as math people. And so we just have to be conscious and aware that that is what we are sowing.
That makes a ton of sense. And I'm wondering as well, because like you'd said, yeah, if you want people to come on board, then yeah, we have to throw our ideas together and we really have to make sure that everyone's voice is being heard, regardless of whether we agree or disagree with some of their reasoning. And that segues nicely into stage number 2. When we talk about eliminating remedial level courses, I can only imagine that a lot of department members, so a lot of math teachers, might really struggle with this idea, as it might be scary for some to think like, well, what do I do? I know John and I both have philosophies on how we try to teach in order to ensure that all students can access the mathematics in the classroom. What were your thoughts on that? Like when you were trying to get your team to consider this idea of trying to remove remedial level courses, what did that look like, sound like, and what did it look like after? Like once you get that stage and you actually do that, how do you ensure that you're setting yourself up for the greatest success for the students and then also for the teachers to feel like they're prepared to actually deliver effective math curriculum?
Sure. So I think too, you just hit it right on the head. Eliminating remedial classes is really the shallow version of recognizing that rigorous instruction is important. And so step 1 was introducing rigorous instruction. And so then it's really hard to differentiate between, and here we call them standards versus honors level tracks or streams. So if every student is receiving rigorous instruction and the instruction isn't watered down, then how do you tell a difference between the courses? And if you can't answer that question after you've done that work of introducing rigorous instruction, then maybe those remedial courses are really a barrier and an inequity to the students that are in them. So that was 1. 2, I think when we employed step 1 with the metrics-based recommendations, what we realized is that all of our students were prepared based on the metrics that everyone chose and decided on. It's recognizing sometimes that these metrics actually just erase the need for these remedial classes. And so one of the teachers that was predominantly teaching some of these foundations level classes, what we called them here at this school, said, you know what, the content, when you slow it down that much and you're still teaching rigorously, it almost creates too much behavior, too many issues for classroom management, because they realize, the students realize, why are we doing this same thing again? I mastered it yesterday. Why am I having to do this again when everybody else has moved forward? And so those were some issues that we started to have a conversation about what we keep having. And so you can begin to see how this is a compounding effect of systemic inequities. We keep having more behavioral write-ups out of our foundations classes than anywhere else. Is that because of the kids that are in there? Is that because of the nature of the instruction that is in that class? Right? And we ended up going back and going, oh, look, it's the instruction. So if we eliminated this, are those kids, I'm using air quotes again, bad kids? Absolutely not. They weren't bad kids. They were excellent kids who were good mathematical thinkers who were been placed in a track that did not serve them. And it caused them to act behaviorally in a way that they were bored. They didn't understand why they were placed in a track that made them feel less than their peers. And so we received actions from them that said that they understood that, which often looked like misbehavior.
Yeah. And I think a lot of teachers right now can imagine that so many kids are misbehaving because of those reasons and would wish that this magic wand could eliminate that and go to, eliminating these remedial level courses. And I really like that you've brought up, like, you're not eliminating remedial level courses. We're introducing rigor into the classes that were labeled easy or labeled easier tracked, or remedial. So I really like that stage 2. It's so important to think about if we want to, say, detrack our classes. The last stage was really eye-opening to me, and I never really thought about it, about detracking teachers. But when you were talking about this, and I wouldn't mind you explain this a little bit for people, but it made complete sense, because when I started teaching, like my first year, you're told, like, you got to put your dues in. You're not going to teach calculus for a while. You're not going to teach the senior level classes for a while, because you got to put your dues in to get up to those ranks. Can you talk a little bit about that teacher tracking and like why you thought this was necessary to change?
Sure. One, I'll just kind of throw out a book for people who are thinking about this as a resource. Catalyzing Change is a book that NCTM put out in 2017, and they kind of walk through some of these same things. It just so happens we did this work in like 2015 after I read that book, and I was like, yeah, that's exactly what that is. It gave some grammar and some language to some of the things that we were experiencing. At the school that I was at, we were predominantly first, second, and third year teachers, and I had more experience than like most of the body of our department combined. So that was an awkward interchange because it's like, well, does my experience beget that I should teach these upper level courses? And here in North Carolina, at least, sometimes upper level means honors level, and sometimes upper level means juniors and seniors. And so it kind of is a balance between. Most teachers want to teach some honors level and some juniors and seniors, and they want to kind of have a mixed bag in their repertoire. And I often remember people being like, well, nobody wants to teach, again, here it comes back to stage 2, nobody wants to teach all foundations or remedial courses all day long. And I'm like, well, then why do we have them? Right? If we don't want to teach them, it's not necessarily just because we don't want to teach them that we shouldn't have them. But like, if they're not serving the teachers, and now we already know they're not serving the students, then why do they exist? Part of the thing that was the most difficult is when we realized what courses we were going to eliminate out of the remedial courses that we had, where we placed the students using metrics, and then those classes basically disappeared because we realized no kids were being placed in there based off of the metrics we had. Well, there were still teachers that were siloed into teaching those courses. So I'm not sure what your course names are there, but maybe it would be like if you have an Algebra 2 teacher as a teacher who defines themselves as the one content area course content that they teach. And so prior to the Common Core State Standards here in North Carolina, we had a lot of people who identified as geometry teachers and algebra teachers or Algebra 2 teachers or pre-calculus teachers. And again, flipping that on the head, I don't know that our job is to teach the mathematics as much as it is to teach the students in the mathematics classroom. Mathematics is the vehicle to help our students become better citizens in society. It is not necessarily the end all be all. The goal is not necessarily for them to leave and become mathematicians. So if that's not the goal, then what is the point of their 13-year experience with mathematics? So that's hard because there is tension when a teacher silos themselves and they identify as a course. And so part of teacher tracking is saying, no, that course content belongs to the students. That course content belongs to the kids who are taking that class, not necessarily to the teacher who is, even though they have maybe mastered teaching that class. And since our job is to teach students, how do we make sure that we as teachers have a well-rounded background on teaching all of the kids in our repertoire and not necessarily a particular type of course? When we did eliminate those remedial courses, one of the teachers was predominantly teaching just that one course that got eliminated. And there was a lot of tension for a while. They were like, well, who am I if I'm not this teacher, not teaching
that's
this
that
content?
identity you were referencing earlier, but now for the teacher, right?
Right. Again, exactly what you said, Kyle, is this is all about identity formation, right? Is who are we becoming? And so what we saw with that teacher was that she realized that she was becoming a math teacher, not a specialized content course named teacher. And so teacher tracking doesn't just show up that way as the way we silo ourselves. It also happens exactly as you said, John, when we tell our beginning teachers they shouldn't have access to seniors or upper level classrooms or honors classrooms or AP advanced placement classes because of their youth or inexperience with teaching. And so that often is another way that we track teachers. And so our goal was to look at who was being assigned what courses and how could we make sure that that was an equitable experience for people.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point to make. And, there's part of me where balance is always key, I think, in pretty much everything in life, right? Balance. And I always advocate to not shuffle teachers around too much just for the sake of shuffling them around. I always like them to gain some experience, some expertise, but not to the point, like you had said, where now it's like, this is who I am. This is all I do. And I love how you've referenced, like, we are teaching these students. And John and I have said this on the podcast before, we'll bump into students that we taught 5 years ago, sometimes 10 years ago. And, a question we often ask is like, what's a memorable moment for you? Like we ask all our guests the same question. We ask our former students that and we say, what was a memorable moment from math class? And they never talk about the content. So if you're the geometry teacher, they're not remembering that. And we're trying to prepare them, as you said, to be ready to be great citizens, to be great people and do great things. And I think that is so important. And the other piece I think is really, if you don't get outside of one particular course, like let's say Algebra 2, how can you ever know and understand where students are coming from, like both content-wise, also in their own development, as human beings, and where they're going? So when students are struggling in my Algebra 2 class, what do I do if I don't understand the math content because I have no experience teaching Algebra 1 or I have no experience teaching anything prior to that or after that? That really poses some challenges when, you had mentioned like some teachers feel like they've mastered that course. And I might argue that you might have that confidence like you've mastered it, but you're probably not reaching the needs of every single student in your classroom. So I really like this idea of making sure that we're not just teaching a course or the content. We're actually teaching these students. And that means we need to have a little bit more experience outside of one particular course.
Right. And I think, too, exactly what you said, Kyle, is this idea that each course is bookended on both sides, right, until they get to their senior year. And even then, for some of our students, that is still bookended by college courses. So to try to really think about that, this is almost an elitist position that I have mastered teaching a course without ever having teaching the course that has come before it or the course that has come after it within the last 3 years of my teaching is a falsity, right? It's a myth that we're telling ourselves because we haven't been able, even if we say, well, I know what was in that course, I've been able to bridge that gap. If we believe that mathematics as a field is constantly changing, then should we not also act that way in the way that we teach our courses? Like if we're teaching math classes, if we believe that mathematics, when we talk to mathematicians these days, right, those people who are current mathematicians, they don't talk about mathematics as static and fixed. They talk about it as dynamic, something that is social, something that is moving, something that is fuzzy, right? We have this whole branch of mathematics that's like fuzzy mathematics topics, fuzzy logic. I love it. How in the world could we say that we have cornered, like we have mastered teaching a course when that is what the nature of our course content is? That is something that still baffles me.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And like we've said, and both of you have said, that it's more about teaching the kids anyway, like teaching the kids that you have in front of you. And they change all the time. Like you've got new kids every single year or every single half year, or you're teaching 3-4 different classes a day. It's just this teaching gig we have is so complex. And I think we could keep talking about this forever. And we're looking at the time here and we've been chatting for a while and we've got more questions to ask Lauren. And I don't think we're going to be able to get to them tonight. Lauren, thanks so much for speaking with us about your presentation and so many other ideas, which I'm kind of summarizing as like authoring identities. It's been a truly rich experience for both Kyle and I and the listeners that are listening to this right now. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I've so enjoyed our conversation and I look forward to many more conversations online and on Twitter too.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Lauren. We'll talk to you soon. We want to thank Lauren again for spending some time with us to share her ideas and insights with us and you, the Math Moment Maker community.
How do you create a culture of engagement and participation in your math class to ensure students are leaning in to learn? And once students are leaning in, how are we going to tackle new mathematical ideas in the ways that build necessary conceptual understanding and developing procedural fluency over time?
Finally, how can we craft lessons in such a way that every student can access the mathematical content and they don't just throw their arms up in frustration? We believe that all of the above are important parts of an effective math lesson, but successfully implementing all of them can be a challenge. That's why we came up with the Make Math Moments 3-part framework to deliver math lessons that students will not only love, but will learn from.
You can learn more about why we created the 3-part framework and what are the necessary pieces that you need to know about so you can run your classroom lessons without a hitch. Head over to makemathmoments.com/framework to learn more. Head to makemathmoments.com/framework.
In order to ensure you don't miss out on any new episodes as they come out each week, be sure to hit that subscribe button. That means right now, hit that subscribe button on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform.
Also, if you're liking what you're hearing, please share the podcast with a colleague and help us reach a wider audience by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts and tweeting us at Make Math Moments on Twitter.
Show notes and links to resources from this episode can be found at makemathmoments.com/episode 56. That's makemathmoments.com/episode 56.
We release a new episode every Monday morning. Keep an eye out for our next episode.
Well, until next time, my friends, I'm Kyle Pierce.
And I'm John Orr.
High fives for us.
And high fives for you.